This is crazy. This is crazy. This is crazy.
Everywhere you turn, it's the same old sports talk, the same headlines, the same news, and the same boring information. This podcast is here to change all of that. We bring you hot sports takes, winning sports betting strategy and picks, reliable gaming industry news, and breaking interviews with some of the biggest names in sports business. My name is Ryan Newple, and welcome to the Noop Sports Show. Hey there, welcome back to the VIP Power Players Show. This is episode number 2. Thank you so much for listening. I'm your host, Noop, and I'm here today with none other than Nik Bonaddio, who is the CEO and founder of NumberFire.com. Nik joins us today, and he talks about how he started his company back in 2010, 2011 timeframe, and he gives us some very cool stories about how he started his company and his journey along the way to bring NumberFire to where it is today. So without further ado, thanks again for listening, and we're going to jump right in to our interview with Nik Bonaddio. Today we are joined by a special guest. Nik Bonaddio is with us. Nik is the CEO and the founder of NumberFire.com. NumberFire is one of the leading sports analytics companies in the world. Nik, thanks for being here with us on the VIP Power Players Show.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. You know, we're trying to interview all the influential people in this industry, and you were one that stood out. So, hey, give us a quick overview of what NumberFire is for some of our listeners that may not have heard of it or may not be using it. Just give us a quick overview of what it is and maybe how it would help the DFS and gambling and maybe even other industries.
Sure. So NumberFire is a sports analytics platform. So if you've heard of Moneyball, read the book, seen the movie, what we do from a mathematical perspective is very similar to that. What's been interesting about the Moneyball revolution is that a lot of those insights, a lot of those machine learning techniques never really got translated outside of the front offices. Surely you can agree that there's been a data revolution within sports, and everything that happens within sports is meticulously tracked and reported. But so much of the fantasy content that's out there is very qualitative. It's, people talking about their hunches or giving their opinions on things. And when you look at sports through a rational lens, with all the data that surrounds it, it's really no different than any other industry like finance or real estate or anything else. And so we approach the world of sports in a very mathematical data science way, and that allows us to present insights that are somewhat unique in the industry and certainly make the offerings that we provide much more quantitative than other places around the internet.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, you mentioned Moneyball and you mentioned some of these professional sports, teams and things that are really going the analytics way. I'm curious, are these teams using NumberFire, and is that something that, are they partnered with you or using your product and your website?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to any specific deals for various reasons, But yeah, we have worked with different teams. We work with different agents and players as well. Anywhere where, it's in your best interest to make the best decision, you want to have the best information available. And that's everything from what plays to call to what players to sign, how much should you value a free agent, how would a certain player play in a certain offense. It's definitely been interesting to see how sports has changed in the past 10 years in this regard. Some sports obviously are a bit ahead of others. Baseball has always been the progenitor in this space. But even sports that are more difficult to model from a data perspective and feature perhaps more old school thinking like football have really embraced it in the past couple of years. That's not to say that I think that any singular team will suddenly all become completely data driven. I think there's always going to be room for qualitative analysis and the old school scout. But I think we're far past the point of no return. So far as teams recognizing the value and realigning their scouting departments along those lines.
Absolutely, for sure. So take us back a little bit. I mean, how did you come up with this concept? What got you started with NumberFire? Any kind of experiences that really led you to NumberFire?
Well, you're in luck because I've got a great story for you. So I'm born and raised in Pittsburgh, so huge sports town. Anyone who's ever been to Pittsburgh or knows a Pittsburgher can tell you that us Yinzers are big sports fans. So Steelers, Penguins, the whole deal.
For sure.
But I have a computer science background, so while my number one hobby is sports, I never really never really figured I'd have a career in sports. I'm just, not an athlete, not a coach. So I figured it was always going to be a hobby of mine. So I have a background in computer science. I went to school at Carnegie Mellon, which is one of the better computer science schools in the country. And I always thought I'd do something in the computer industry, the technology industry, and so on. I'm a huge and very avid, to this day, fantasy football player. And one of my ongoing frustrations with fantasy football was that, a lot of the content I was reading was very, very qualitative. And it didn't really make sense to me because, again, if you look at sports is essentially a data problem, but people were trying to solve it in very qualitative ways. What had happened is, a lot of companies started coming to the market with different APIs and different ways to access that information. And in the same way that hedge funds exist on Wall Street, I thought there'd be an opportunity to go and take that information and, use the same machine learning and data mining techniques that you'd see in other industries and apply it to fantasy sports. Now, that wasn't a business. It was just kind of a hobby of mine until I was on the TV show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. So I was on the game show with Regis. I think it's about 2010, maybe 2011. I ended up winning $100,000 on the game show and promptly quit my job that I was at and started NumberFire the next day.
That's
and
awesome.
That's where it all started.
That's a really cool story. No, I hadn't heard that story. Very cool. So how was it being on the Millionaire show? Who Wants to Be a Millionaire?
It was it was very nerve-wracking. Because I'm not a TV guy. I mean, I guess I am now because I'm more used to being on TV and radio. Sure. But back then, I'm just some random guy. But Regis was very nice to me. Regis saw that I was nervous and was very reassuring to me. And what's different about Millionaire than maybe some other game shows is that you have to qualify for it. So you can't just be some guy off the streets. You do have to pass a test to be smart enough to be there. So I just remember telling myself, you earned your right to be here. And I always kind of knew I needed about $100,000 to start NumberFire because, a project like NumberFire isn't just, hey, start a website. There's a lot of coding involved, a lot of mathematics involved. And, it was going to take a while to get it off the ground. So once I got to 100,000, I walked away and just took my money and started the company. That was sort of the first step of the process. Obviously beyond that, we raised venture capital financing here in New York City, mostly due to my connections from already being in the technology world, having worked for startups already. And then, fast forward to about 2 years ago when we were purchased by FanDuel. So it's been a really cool ride, a lot of great partnerships. And, despite being, even though we got bought by FanDuel, the mission of NumberFire still continues to this day. They've been a really great partner of ours and have allowed us to continue our vision and really deliver great stuff to DFS and fantasy football players alike.
Absolutely. Well, that's a cool story. I didn't realize that. Congratulations, and I'm glad you won that because we wouldn't have what is NumberFire today. So that's awesome.
That's exactly right. So whenever people ask me, how do I get my business off the ground, what I tell them is to go be on a game show because that's the way it is.
It's that easy. Yeah.
Yep.
Awesome. So the website, so NumberFire has exploded. I mean, I think you've said, or I've seen over 700,000 subscribers. At its peak, maybe 5 million users or something like that. Did you ever dream it would get this big when you started? I mean, was that like a goal of yours, or were you like, I'll just see where this goes?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I mean, no in the sense that, I never thought that we'd raise VC money. I never thought we'd sell the company. All those things, just was part of just a serendipitous journey. But, yes, in the sense that, my team worked really hard. And, we really love what we do, and that translates into great products. Mm-hmm. But also, I say yes in the sense that I think we always saw fantasy sports as a very large growing industry. There's a TV show about it. There's there's hundreds of podcasts and video series about it. It's gone from what is kind of a niche, nerdy hobby into a very mainstream activity. And so when we started, it was still maybe a kind of a smaller market, and obviously DFS wasn't around. But I think we did have the insight when we started the company to realize that this was something that was growing, and this was something that needed a product like ours to sort of help people make better decisions. And so, I thought it was possible, but I didn't necessarily think it was going to be me that was going to do it. So it's been a great ride.
That's awesome. And you mentioned some of this stuff here, but with every business there comes some challenges. And you mentioned, your staff, and there's math, and there's coding, and there's all this stuff that goes into. It's not just like starting up a company is simple. Can you explain to our listeners maybe some of the biggest challenges that, you were running into maybe when you started, or that you're experiencing even today? Just some of the biggest challenges that you've had starting and running NumberFire.
Sure. Well, in the early days, it was a technological problem. Back then, the APIs to get the data didn't really exist, and there really wasn't the computing power to be able to do a lot of the math that we wanted to do. We're talking 6 or 7 years ago. So this is before, before big data techniques, before Hadoop, before a lot of that stuff. And so it just was, it was a very large tech problem back then. So that was the first problem. The second one was, when we went out to raise VC capital, even though I did have some background having worked for different startups, it was a very difficult time convincing people that this was more than just, a hobby. This was more than, just what is called a lifestyle business in the VC world. And we really had to sell people on where fantasy football was going, and really sell people on the amount of money that was transacted in the world of fantasy sports. So, like any person who's raised VC financing, I must have got 35, 40 no's before I got a single yes. And people tend to think that if I got a great idea, it's going to be easy for me to raise financing, just because I've seen a lot of other people do it. And it's a huge slog, and it's just a lot of no's, and you really have to have a lot of belief in what you're doing, but also really, kind of, ignore the no's and just keep grinding until it happens. And, in the early days, that was, really the only opportunity we had, because we had already built the thing. So the only way for us to keep it going was to figure out a way. And, sure enough, we found some great investors, and we were off to the races. Later in the company's life cycle, the challenges are just, scaling challenges. As you go from 5 employees to 15 employees, how do you maintain company culture? How do you maintain quality of products? Those are all typical challenges I think companies make. When you make the jump from, what is like a 1 or 2 person company where it's all about you, to one that's larger, and, you have to think about different aspects of running a business from an operational perspective, those are always difficult challenges. Because my background is in tech and not necessarily a more traditional business background, I was always much more focused on the building of the product and, the engineering and the design of it, and, some of the finer aspects of actually running a business from an operational perspective, I always found kind of challenging. So, for me, that was always a bit difficult. And then, getting around the time when we got bought by FanDuel, this may seem like sort of a first world problem, but, it was difficult for us to determine what the right decision was when those opportunities became available to us. On one hand, we had a fantastic offer to join the FanDuel team and, have the intellectual property that we built, have a really great home, and just kind of get springboarded from that. And on the other side of it, it's potentially raising more VC capital, or maybe some other people who are interested in acquiring us. And at that time, that was incredibly stressful for me, because, I want to do right by my team. I want to do right by my investors. I want to do right by everyone I can. And, at the time, it was just a very, very difficult decision to make, because it's hard to know what the right decision is until you make one and just kind of play it out. And so, that was a particularly stressful time in my life. Although it was a positive amount of stress, it was one of those things where, I definitely felt I had a lot of people relying on me, and I definitely wanted to do right by everybody. So it was a challenging couple of months for sure.
Absolutely. I mean, can you talk a little bit about how that came about? I mean, I don't know how much you can talk about, but how did the FanDuel deal come about? I mean, did they just see what a great product you had and approach you? Was it something from your end that you kind of inquired with them about, or where did that come from?
Yeah, I mean, like within the tech world, the common maxim is that companies are bought, not sold. So, it certainly wasn't us reaching out to them. I think that would kind of kill our leverage if we had done that. But fantasy sports is a very big industry in terms of people, but a relatively small industry in terms of companies. When you're in this space and you're going to different conferences and stuff like that, you get to know people who are doing cool things. And I had known about FanDuel pretty much from, day one when they started, because it was such a cool concept. And, guys like Nigel and Tom are Scottish, and that alone is unique within the very U.S.-centric world of fantasy football. So that was interesting. And I think we were always kind of like keeping tabs on each other and seeing what the other person was doing. And it really just came about when we realized that, for as much as NumberFire grew and for as well as we were doing on our own, there is such a huge accelerant to being a part of a larger company. And when you look at FanDuel's users and NumberFire users, there's a very large cross promotion between the two. It made a lot of sense, and it was, in retrospect, I'm not just saying this because I'm on the podcast, but in retrospect, it was a fantastic decision that I would do 100 times out of 100. It really was a perfect landing spot for a lot of the products that we built. And as DFS moves into a slightly more mature industry with with different things that are going on, I think that a lot of the technology that we've built behind the scenes can power really a lot of cool new styles of gameplay. So I'm excited about where we're going, and I'm excited to be here. And it's funny. A lot of people ask me, what are you going to do after you sold your company? Because most people who sell companies in the tech space just end up starting another company a couple of years later. They're kind of serial entrepreneurs as far as that goes. I have a very difficult time answering that question because I already started the only company I ever wanted to build. When I think about the hobbies that I have, I really only have two, and that's sports and technology. And so it's hard for me to imagine a company that I would like to work for more than the one I've already started. And other ideas I might have, seem like they could be lucrative and I could, start a company around them, but I don't want to work on them as much as I want to work on NumberFire and work here at FanDuel. So it's, it's one of those things where I'm incredibly blessed to have a great outcome and to work on stuff I love, but also bring some cool stuff to, sports fans everywhere. So every day is just pretty awesome, and I'm very thankful for the way it works out.
I bet, and that kind of goes back to one of your, I just go back to one of your quotes you said earlier, ignore the no's and keep grinding. I mean, that's so, if you would have, took all the no's and just stopped grinding, you would have never got to deal with FanDuel. So, I mean, that's such good advice for the listeners on the line is ignore the no's and keep grinding.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, and I don't want to give too general advice because I think everyone can give like super generalized advice, but, what's interesting about the startup world is that, it's very biased towards success, and that the stories you hear are stories of success. Everyone knows about Facebook and Twitter and like all these big successes because those are very public. But, no one talks about the 90% of companies that failed because, no one wants to talk about that. So, people tend to think that going into the startup world that there's just endless reserves of VC money and it's going to be easy and this or that. Starting the company and just getting off the ground was by orders of magnitude the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. You're talking about working 80, 90-hour weeks. You're taking a huge pay cut because, you're not paying yourself or you're paying yourself less than what your market salary would be. There's no guarantee that the project that you're working on will be accepted by users or will be of any high quality at all. Everything about it is inherently risky. There's obviously high reward to that risk, but, the biggest determining factor that I've seen across the tons of different startups that I've witnessed is that the ones that succeed, have a little bit of luck, but have founders which have just an extreme amount of work ethic and the ability to, keep getting up and keep grinding even in the face of, roadblocks that get thrown in their way.
Sure, for sure. So you mentioned not, you're not probably going on to a new company, or it's hard to even imagine doing that. But what's next for you? What's next for the NumberFire team? I mean, is there anything you'd like to see this website have? Is there something in the works that you can talk about publicly? What's next for you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's been interesting about the evolution of NumberFire is, when we started, we were basically a data company. We were in the business of, just kind of saying, hey, here's some data tables, and do with it what you want. We quickly realized that people needed that data to be framed in a narrative, and so we started writing articles, and then we started doing podcasts, and then we started doing videos, and over time, that's interestingly enough turned us into more of a media company than a data company. So we've gotten very, very good at writing articles and producing types of media that break down our data in a more interesting way. And so I think that you'll see us continue down that path, doubling down on video, doubling down on podcasting, still with the same high quality, still with the same quantitative background to all of our content, but we're going to figure out new and interesting ways to bring that information to you in a very consumable way. And so, that's always interesting to me to figure out a way to package it up in a way that anyone who wants to use it can use it without having to break out a calculus book to understand what we're talking about. In some other fronts, esports is always very interesting. No one can deny the growth of esports. I think it's very much infancy relative to the data that's available to people like me. It's in its infancy relative to sort of mainstream acceptance and so on. But that's obviously a huge opportunity. I think everyone has an eye to. Things like VR and AR. We're obviously aware of the signs of where it's going. It's kind of hard for me to figure out where exactly the fantasy and DFS implications of that are. But, one of the interesting things about NumberFire relative to FanDuel is that, we're sort of set up to be a bit of an R&D laboratory type setup for FanDuel. And so that gives us some leeway to kind of, take some big bets and throw some stuff at the wall and see what sticks. And so I'm interested to explore things like VR and AR and esports and really come up with, some cool stuff that may influence what fantasy sports looks like in, 5 or 6 years. Yeah,
that's awesome. Well, we'll get closing here, but, this isn't an advertisement. We're not having you on to pump people over to NumberFire. I'm sure most of our listeners are probably using NumberFire already. But, if there are listeners out there that aren't listening, what's one good reason, or what's something that NumberFire can offer these casual DFS players or the casual sports bettor? Why should they start using it, and how can they start using it? Just head over to the website and sign up. Is it free? Give us a little plug. I know you're not trying to sell it today at all, but just give us a little plug of why my listeners should be listening or tuning in to NumberFire.
Sure. It's funny you mentioned that. I was just talking to one of my business guys a second ago, and he was trying to give me these little bullet points, make sure you say that, we're 70% better, these sort of businessy buzzword things. I actually hate that stuff. I'm not a big fan of the super toutishness of certain websites, and that's not who I am. I would say, what I've always found valuable about NumberFire, and what I think everyone will find valuable about NumberFire, is that there's no concept of human editing to it. So this is what the data says. This is backed by data science. This is backed by literally millions of lines of code. And it's back tested, and we've proven it over and over in the marketplace. And so we never want to say to someone that they should use us and, just ignore their own judgment. You should look at us as a quantitative second opinion. This is what the numbers say, and this is what the nerds say, so to speak. We have a very comprehensive package that, regardless of whether you're a DFS player, a season-long player, or involved in the betting markets, or really anything to do with sports, we have a package and a product for you. It's pretty easy. Just go on over to NumberFire. 99% of NumberFire is free. 1% of it is behind a premium paywall. Basically, what the differentiation is if you use it to make money for yourself, then we've got a package around that, because if you're making money, I think we should be making money too. So I think that's only fair. And yeah, I think we've been kind of proved by the market. We've been in business for 7 years. Like you said, we have literally, hundreds of thousands of subscribers, and we probably talk to and reach tens of millions of people a year. And if we do that, then that kind of means we got something right somewhere along the way. So, feel free to go and use our stuff. And if you have any questions or anyone has any comments, they can always email me, nik@numberfire.com. And, I just like talking to sports fans like myself, and I like solving problems, and I like, building stuff. And, I'm always interested to talk to people who have similar passions to me. So, hopefully everyone out there will get a chance to check us out. And, and I would love to hear from you.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Nick. We appreciate it. I know you mentioned that email address, but where else could they, maybe follow what you're up to? Or, are you active on Twitter? Do you have a blog? Anything of those lines that, for our listeners, they want to kind of keep tabs on Nick? How would they do that?
Yeah, so let me tell you a quick story if you have a couple of seconds, just because I just thought about it now.
You do.
And I think your users might be interested in it. So how I came up with the name NumberFire, so when I was working on it and building out the first models, I didn't really have a name for the project, and I was really struggling with what to name it. And I got accepted into a conference run by the tech blog TechCrunch, and they basically said, hey, this is a cool idea. Why don't you come present it in front of a bunch of judges and some VCs? Who knows what will happen? And I was like, all right, that sounds great. To do so, I had to come up with a name and print out materials and big posters and everything else. So my solution was I basically wrote a script that matched up different prefixes like sports and number and, all these different prefixes with a bunch of different suffixes like fire and iant and everything else. And so I matched up all those combinations and then did a search for whether or not the .com of those two were available. And the only combination that was available for a .com was NumberFire.com. That was the only one out of like 1,500 different combinations.
Oh my God.
And so I was like, okay, well, I guess that sounds good. NumberFire.com. Okay. And, at the time, I didn't really think about it too much, so I figured I'd always change it. And now, I actually really like the name. It's funny, when it first happened, I was kind of just like, I don't know. But now I really like the name. So, I basically wrote a script to come up with the name. So it was just sort of one of those random occurrences that has meant everything to the business. But yeah, you can find the company on Twitter, Facebook, pretty much everywhere. Just NumberFire. You can find me, NikBonaddio, Nik Bonaddio, Twitter, Facebook, .com, everything. So I would love to hear from everyone who's listening, and I appreciate everyone's time.
Well, cool. Well, thank you so much, Nick. We appreciate it. Some great stories in there, and I do appreciate you giving us so much time today. And I wish you best of luck, and I wish NumberFire the best of luck, and hopefully we can have you on again in the future when, as things progress.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Noob Sports Show. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider subscribing to our iTunes channel today. Plus, visit us at noobsports.com for more picks, previews, strategy, and news. That's knupsports.com.